Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Read Write Mike podcast. I'm Mike Oakes, and this is episode 6 of the series. And of course, we are talking about the vocabulary curriculum right now in this podcast. I am podcasting to you from lovely Chicago, Illinois, the second city, the Windy City. And you can probably even see behind me, the sun is going to be rising over Lake Michigan as this podcast moves forward. Today, I want to talk a little bit, I want to pause of what we've been talking about lately, which is introducing the different activities. Last 2 weeks, we've talked about different example, non-example activities, yay or nay, would you rather, and the third thing, I can't remember, which, woulda, coulda, shoulda, that's it. And I want to press pause on that and talk about something, that might come up in your conversations from time to time, which is, couldn't vocabulary just be done within the confines of reading workshop, within the space of a session of a mini lesson, work time, conferring in small groups and a share? And my answer is yes and no. And I'll talk about why that is today. We're going to talk about the aspects of vocabulary that can and should be done inside of your reading workshop. And we're going to talk about the aspect that this vocabulary curriculum addresses, which is something that goes outside of reading workshop. All right, so let's get started. So the first thing to keep in mind is what vocabulary sort of addresses versus what reading workshop specifically addresses. And it's this dichotomy between content versus skills. That is, knowing what versus knowing how. Another ways to think about this is explicit knowledge versus implicit, factual or conceptual versus procedural knowledge. You hear about these all the time, content versus skills. Now, both of these are different kinds of knowledge, right? So content knowledge is going to be knowledge that you can retrieve from your long-term memory with immediacy, right? If I ask you, like, what color are polar bears? You don't need to think about it. It's white, right? If I ask you, what's 1 + 1? You don't have to think about it. You say 2. If I asked you to think about your first phone number that you ever remembered, you'd say something like 386-9876. That's mine. I haven't dialed it in 35 plus years, but yet it comes to me with immediacy. That's going to be content, factual, explicit knowledge that you retrieve from your long-term memory. Now, on the other hand, there's also another type of knowledge, procedural knowledge, skills, right? And this kind of knowledge is a lot of times things that you do. And so these things are things like riding a bike, right? Once you learn how to ride a bike, you don't need to think, gosh, I need to press my left leg forward this much and then my right leg forward this much. It's not like explicitly in your mind. It is implicitly in your mind. You know how to do it. Or driving a car, or frankly, a lot of the things that we do in the reading and writing workshop, writing with fluency, reading with automaticity. These things are skills, the thing that we teach when we teach things like, thinking about character traits and things of that nature. And so what you'll find is the reading workshop is usually a place where you teach skills. You're teaching procedural knowledge the predominant amount of time. You're not necessarily teaching content knowledge unless in reading workshop you are reading to gain that content. And that is one way to learn vocabulary, which we're going to talk about next. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the 4 major places where you can acquire vocabulary and which of those can be done in reading workshop, and which, because reading workshop focuses on skills, on procedural implicit knowledge and not explicit conceptual factual knowledge, you may have to find an extra little bit of time outside of the reading workshop to do some vocabulary work, thus the vocabulary curriculum. So let's take a pause for a quick moment and think about that. So when we're thinking about the 4 major areas of vocabulary acquisition, we're going to think of these 4. If you've seen me present around vocabulary, you're probably familiar with these. If you read Michael Graves' vocabulary book, you're going to be familiar with these. But here they are, and I'm going to share them in ascending order of importance. So the number 4 influence on vocabulary acquisition is creating an environment of of logophilia, of word love. And these are just things that you do, you being you, loving vocabulary. You're celebrating words, you're curious about words, and you are just fostering that in kids too. You're basically being what you want to see with regard to vocabulary. That will create this culture of word love. This does not need any extra time in the day. In fact, this happens all across the day, and it can happen in your reading workshop, and it can happen also in your interactive read aloud, but it happens all day, every day, cultivating word love. So you don't need to carve any extra amount of time for vocabulary acquisition to do this. Then the number 3 influence we have word solving strategies. Now, since these are strategies are skills, right? Strategies are how to the what. The skills are the what, the strategies are the how. So word solving strategies are things that you would be doing in your reading workshop. This is stuff like context clues, figuring out words by looking at their word parts, prefixes, suffixes, roots, and figuring out what they might mean. Using tools like dictionaries, and if it's writing workshop, a thesaurus. These word solving strategies are definitely things that are already happening in your reading workshop. And so you teach this as a mini lesson to kids, you teach it as a conference to individuals, you teach it as a small group, you'd give it as a tip and a share. These are this is procedural knowledge, this is skills, this is stuff that would fit perfectly in reading workshop. So as you can see, so far of the 2 of the 4 already fit within reading workshop vocabulary acquisition. Number 2, learning individual words, is something that it's conceptual knowledge, right? It's factual knowledge, it's explicit. That's not what happens in reading workshop. In reading workshop, we learn skills. And so this is what the vocabulary curriculum does. It carves out 5 minutes a day for kids to learn words at a depth. Some words, not all words. And this is part of any vocabulary experts, when they're talking about vocabulary acquisition, they talk about learning individual words. This generally tends to happen outside of your traditional reading workshop space. Why? Because reading workshop teaches skills, it teaches procedural knowledge. It doesn't focus so much on content knowledge, other than leaning into the number 1 influence on vocabulary acquisition, which is wide reading. Reading tons, reading independently, reading across genres. And so this obviously happens in reading workshop. When you set off to a work time, when you're reading across genres across the year, when you're reading independently at home and at school, you are reading widely and you're acquiring so much vocabulary. You're acquiring a breadth of words, more words than any one teacher could teach. And this complements what I provide, which is the vocabulary curriculum, which is I'm going to teach you some words. We're going to teach you some words, and we're going to learn them at a depth so that you can compare them to other words. You can transfer them in your speech and in your writing. And if possible, you can use them figuratively. And so the reason for the vocabulary curriculum is it's addressing that one part of vocabulary acquisition that isn't precisely suited to something like a reading workshop session, mini lesson, conference, small group share. And so that's what we're providing. Most of, and a lot of your vocabulary acquisition already occurs in your reading workshop time. But part of the reason why I created this curriculum was because teachers were asking for learning individual words. And because of the nature of reading workshop, it teaches skills, it teaches procedural knowledge predominantly, that we need this extra space. And I'm not asking for a whole extra session of a day, a whole hour, just 5 minutes a day. But does it occur outside of reading workshop? It does. And that's why. So if you ever ask why, can't we just do this in the reading workshop? You can talk about, there's so much we can do with vocabulary acquisition in the reading workshop. There's just one part that's missing. That's the learning individual words. And because of the nature of reading workshop, it teaches procedural knowledge, it teaches skills, and learning individual words is about learning content, right? And so we just need a little bit of time for kids to practice that content, where they can do things like retrieval practice, space practice, interleaving, and so on. All of the ideas of that the cognitive scientists say, how to learn conceptual knowledge in a deep and memorable way. Okay, so we'll press pause on some of the activities this week just to talk a little bit about the why. Why is this a separate thing outside of workshop? Can't we do it in workshop? And so the answer is yes. and no. Next week, I think we'll continue with the activities. I want to share with you about word association games that Beck, McKeon, and Kuchen would call, and the different kinds that you'll see in the curriculum. All right, colleagues, take care. Hope you're enjoying these last few days of summer, and we'll be back together soon.